I guess if you're ready, Fonda, we can get started.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Okay, good. So, thanks everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome. Thank you for coming to our author talk with Fonda Lee, creator of the Green Bone Saga. We'll start off with a quick interview, then a reading from Fonda, followed by questions from the audience. As I said earlier, your microphone and video will be turned off for the webinar, but please feel free to submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A, which is found at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to access live closed captions for this event, click on the CC icon in your Zoom toolbar and then click on Show Subtitle. So San Mateo County Libraries is excited to host Fonda Lee, an award-winning author of science fiction and fantasy. Jade City, I should have held it up, is an action-packed, Asian-inspired fantasy full of clan blood feuds and vicious politics, following the members of the Kaul family as they struggle with their rival clan for control of the island. Fonda's novels also include the epic urban fantasy Green Bone Saga, consisting of Jade City, Jade War, and the upcoming Jade Legacy, as well as the acclaimed science fiction novels Exo, Crossfire, and Zero Boxer. Fonda is a black belt martial artist who loves action movies, and we're so glad to hear you. Thank you, have you here. Thank you for coming, Fonda.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for showing up tonight.
Yes. I'll kick off, I guess, with the first question for the interview. What was your inspiration for the Green Bone Saga, and how do you feel it differs from other fantasy series?
So the Green Bone Saga came to me first as a premise. The world is what sort of came to me first. So as I've now written 6 books, and pretty much every book comes to me in a slightly different way. And it could be a character, it could be a plot point, you know, just a kernel of an idea, and then you sort of accrete material onto it to turn it into a full story. So the Green Bone Saga started off as actually the title. So I wrote Jade City in my writing notebook back in 2013. And it was just the idea of a city that was modern, but also fantastical. And I wrote a line underneath that title, and it said something like, a modern world where combat is hand to hand, but power rests with those with magic jade. And then I put down a wuxia gangster fantasy. And then that was it. I wrote, I have no characters, I have no plot, I don't know where this is going. And then it sat in my notebook for another couple of years. And it just kept noodling there. And as a writer, when an idea doesn't go away, that's usually one that you know you have to pursue. So really, the Green Bone Saga is a mashup of a bunch of things that I really loved. One being you know, crime drama in the vein of The Godfather and Goodfellas, and you know, also like Hong Kong crime drama, like you know, Johnny To movies and kung fu flicks and epic fantasy, all sort of mashed together. And also a little bit of wish fulfillment on my part, because I'm a martial artist. I've been training in martial arts for a long time, and I would watch kung fu movies and be like, wait, I cannot run up walls, I cannot do chi blasts, I cannot do any of the cool stuff that I'm seeing on screen. This is false advertising. So obviously, as a fantasy author, my mind went to, okay, well, what's the reason that these superpowered martial artists have the abilities that they do? So I made Jade a literal power-up in this fantasy world. And I envisioned the story as a Godfather-esque family saga. And that's kind of what brought together, started to inspire me to create the characters and the relationships between those characters, and the story of these 2 clans who end up going to war over control of the magic resource on their island, which is this jade that is found nowhere else in the world. In terms of how it kind of differs from other fantasy, I mean, I grew up reading a lot of epic fantasy and fantasy in general, and the Green Bone Saga, when it came out, Jade City really didn't have many comparables. Like I couldn't say, hey, if you like this, also read this, because it wasn't a traditional medieval fantasy novel. It wasn't and also wasn't a traditional urban fantasy novel because it didn't take place in our world. It's a secondary world that's completely made up. And it's not historical fiction either, but it takes place in kind of like an analog of our late 20th century. So it's one thing that I just am fascinated by and wanted to put into this trilogy was the idea of magic coexisting with technology and the forces of modernization and globalization and all these other things that go on in our modern world, and use that as a backdrop to tell a fantasy story.
That was always one of the hard things when I was trying to like book talk Jade City. You can't just do it in one sentence. There's like so many different influences that are tying in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem, I got it down to calling it an epic urban fantasy Asia inspired gangster family saga, and that's like that's a mouthful, but that's what I started calling it. I've heard people say it's like The Godfather with magic and kung fu, which is probably about as also an apt description, even though it's not quite a crime drama, but it certainly pulls from a lot of those traditions.
Let's do another question. Why do you write fantasy? And I guess you kind of said it. What were your literary influences growing up?
Yeah, so when I was growing up, I was a huge bookworm. I was that kid who would be in the library up until closing time. And I really loved a few different things. One was fantasy and science fiction. I went from reading, Narnia and Chronicles of Prydain to Asimov and Bradbury and Anne McCaffrey. And I also actually really loved animal stories because you would be spending the bulk of the narrative with a non-human protagonist, and you kind of had to live like a being that was very different from you to sort of immerse yourself in that story. And so I always loved the stories that asked what if, and the ones that like took you out of your current day context and stretch the bounds of imagination. So it was really natural for me to become a speculative fiction author. But I think there's sometimes this preconception that speculative fiction is escapist, but I actually feel like it's very much the opposite of that. Speculative fiction and science fiction and fantasy are the ways that I engage with things in our real world, because you take away the specificity of our world and you can dive into and examine a lot of themes and ideas and human truths without the specific label of them that might derail a reader from being able to like fully connect. So you're taking something and that's really recognizable and recontextualizing it. So you're not telling a story, if you're telling a story in a fantasy world that's really about a refugee crisis, if you tried to tell that story in you could tell any number of those stories in nonfiction, in fiction, in historical fiction, about specific refugee crises that have happened in our world. But if you turn that into a refugee crisis of a planet that is about to die and people on that planet who are trying to leave to go to another place that won't have them, you're now universalizing an experience, and you're causing the reader to connect on a more fundamental level. So that's why I write speculative fiction. I try to write fantasy and science fiction that has a coolness element, something that sucks you in, right? There's always something about fantasy and science fiction that's just cool, that makes you want to spend time in that world. But once you're there, I'm going to make you think. I'm going to engage you with ideas and themes that you will find very recognizable. And it should feel very real. My goal writing the Green Bone Saga was that this place, John Loon, should feel like a real place. It should feel like a place you could get on an airplane and you could fly there and you could walk down the street and recognize the restaurants and the cars, and that these characters who populate the world have very human motivations. And even though they are very different from you and I want you to be so immersed in that world that you understand the decisions that they make.
It's definitely very grounded compared to like Lord of the Rings, where you can kind of understand the characters, but you're right, you definitely made it super relatable, and I lost my train of thought, but yes, very grounded.
Yeah, I tend to write speculative fiction that is low magic. To the extent, and what I mean by that, it's a term that's used in the genre to denote something where like the magic is, it's not going to make you be able to do crazy, amazing spells and have incredible, like godlike powers. There is this element that we don't have in our world, but my characters never actually refer to the magic as magic. To them, it's just part of their world, just like there's things in our world that might seem kind of magical to someone who's visiting it.
I did also like how you incorporated shine into it. I think that also made it sort of very realistic sound feeling, because you had one element and you combined another one that applies to real world issues as well, like you just said.
Right. Yeah. So for those of you who are like, you just popped in, you're like, who, what? I had no idea. I've never heard of Fonda Lee or her books. So in the Green Bone Saga, it takes place on a fictional island in which there's this one substance, jade, which gives people who wear it these supernatural abilities. And one of the things that has happened is that it used to be that only the people who lived on this island could harness the jade, but foreign powers have obviously learned of jade's existence and want to be able to use it as well. So they've developed a drug that will allow those people who don't have the right genetic predisposition, the right amount of training, to be able to wear jade. And that upends kind of the world as we know it from the point of view of the characters who live on this island. And what I was really doing there is having a conversation between like magic and tech, right? Like oftentimes we read fantasy novels in which the magic has always been there. Certain people have the right bloodline to use magic. Magic is very unknowable. But in my world, magic it's a resource. I mean, it's literally a rock that can be mined out of the ground and processed and distributed and sold. And so, of course, somebody in a lab is going to figure out how to circumvent the blood advantage that the people who could always use the magic had, but other people want that as well. So it was a way for me to also change the dynamic of society in this fictional island, Kekon, so that eventually the two main clans, this island is ruled by two clan families, end up in a conflict that snowballs into warfare.
I think we might have time for one more interview question before the reading. How did you become a writer?
Oh, so writing is my second profession. I have wanted to be a writer since I was 10 years old, and I had a very long bus ride in which I wrote a lot. So I wrote a 300-page fantasy novel when I was in 5th grade. And so I've always wanted to write, but I never really thought that it was a real job, so to speak. And I had an entire other career where I was in business and did management consulting and corporate strategy. And at some point realized, like my actual passion is writing fiction. So I did a pretty dramatic career shift. about 10 years ago, and started devoting time to writing and to learning, taking classes, and then eventually to finishing manuscripts, querying, getting an agent, going through the publication process, and so on. So my first novel came out in 2015, and then those were followed up with a duology, in a young adult duology in 2017 and 2018, and then the Green Bone Saga, which has consumed like the last 6 years of my life.
Oh, I guess that was a quicker answer. You want to do one more before?
Sure.
Okay, let's do. We can't wait for Jade Legacy, the last of the Green Bone Saga. What was the process like writing a trilogy?
Oh, so long. The answer is long. I think that, you know, when you sign up to write a trilogy, you're signing up for at least 3 years of solidly working on this thing. In my case, these books are long, so it's been about 6 years that I've spent working on it. And you know, I think the great thing about writing a trilogy is you get to really know the world and the characters. You get to spend a lot of time with them, and the readers get that too. You've already invested so much time and energy into creating the world and to getting to know these characters that you want to take greater advantage of that. But it's no mean feat, because the second book is really hard, because you have to take everything that was good about the first book and then like amp that up even more in the second book. You know, you've heard of the second book syndrome or the soggy middle, and I was really determined to not have that happen. So I was obsessively figuring out how to write a second book that was going to like amp everything up and be better. And then the third book is also a beast, because you have to bring everything to a close. So, you know, I would say after this, I'm going to write some short stuff. I actually have a couple of novellas lined up, so I can just reset my brain from writing this long epic trilogy.
I had a follow-up question to your last answer. Do you still have that first fantasy novel you wrote, and have you reread it?
You know, it's probably in like a cardboard box in my parents' basement or something like that. I'm not going to reread it. Maybe I will just one day for, you know, kicks and giggles. But I find oftentimes you go back and you read your old stuff and you're like, whoa, like this is someone else wrote this. It feels very strange.
Sometimes you don't even remember writing that scene. Like, what was this? Was this a dream? Yeah. Okay, are you ready for your reading portion?
Yeah. So I will read a short scene from Jade City. And for those of you who haven't read it, I want to pick a scene that doesn't have a lot of spoilers. So I'm actually going to read a scene that's a bit of a flashback. So the main characters in this book are the siblings in a family. So the Kaul family is they're the leaders of one of the major clans, and they're our protagonists. And this island, Kekon, has a long history of foreign invasion and repelling the foreign invaders and so on. So I'm going to read a little bit of this particular scene. Unlike his siblings, Lon remembered his father. In the last year of the Many Nations War, some months before Kaul Dushuran fell in one of the many battles against the beleaguered Shotarian army, Lon asked his father, "Who will be in charge of Kekon when the Shotties are gone? Will it be you?" "No," said Kaldu indulgently. "It won't be me." "Will it be Granda or Aitchen?" "It won't be any of us. We're green bones." His father was copying a list of names, a train schedule, and a map onto 3 separate sets of paper and sealing them in unmarked envelopes. Gold and jade, never together. Why do people say that? Lon had often heard the phrase in casual conversation. Gold and jade was a Kekonese idiom that referred to greed and excess, an inappropriate level of overreach. A person hoping for too much good fortune might be warned, don't ask for gold and jade. A child who demanded a custard tart after having already had a sweet bun was, Lon knew from personal experience, likely to be scolded. You want gold and jade together. Lon's father glanced up at him with a squint. For a moment, Lon was afraid that his persistent questions had annoyed his father and he would be sent out of the room so the man could finish his task in peace. Kaul was not a regular presence in the house. He and Lon's grandfather were gone for long periods of time on secretive missions. And when they were back, Lon's grandmother and mother treated the occasion like a personal visit from the gods, a great honor, an unnatural disruption, something to be celebrated, but best gotten through quickly. Kaul kissed his children, but did not know how to relate to them. He spoke to Lon as he would an adult. In the other room, Lon's infant brother Hilo wailed as their mother tried to comfort him. A long time ago, many hundreds of years before the Shotarians came, there were 3 kingdoms on Kekon. Kaul spoke while directing half of his attention back to his lists and maps. The kingdom of John along the northern coast where we are now, Hunto in the central basin, and Taido on the southern peninsula. Hunto was the strongest, but the Hunto king was thin-blooded and obsessed with jade. One night, he went horribly insane from the itches and swept through the palace, murdering his family, including his own children. Lon's eyes drifted to the ample jade his father wore around his neck and wrists. Noticing this, Kaul grinned and snatched Lon by the arm, pulling him close with rough affection. Does that worry you, son? Kaul yanked his talon knife from the sheath on his belt and held it up between them. Lon could see how fine the edge was, how the hilt was weathered to his father's hand. Are you worried about your Da? What might happen to him? Kaul asked. No, Lon said, his voice calm. At the age of 8, he knew that all the men of his family were green bones, and this meant they wore jade and swore oaths to a secret clan that fought against the injustice of the foreigners. Good, said his father, his arm still tight around Lon's shoulders. You needn't be. Some people are meant to carry jade, and some aren't. You are, and so is your little brother. Same as your Da and Granda. Here, hold the talon knife. Don't you have one of your own yet? Gods, you should. I should have seen to that already. Go on, it's only a few stones. It won't hurt you. Lon held the knife and spun it in his grip the way he practiced with a toy one. The jade pieces in the hilt were smooth to the touch and made his chest buzz in a warm and pleasant way, as if he'd taken a great gasp of air after holding his breath for a long time. His father looked on approvingly. Lon said, so what happened after the king killed his family? Kaul took his talon knife and returned it to its sheath. With the Hunto royal family all dead, the kingdoms of John and Taido invaded it and carved it up between them, then went to war with each other. Eventually, Kekon was united. From then on, it was decreed for the safety of the country that those who govern would not wear jade, and those who wear jade would not govern. In the other room, Hilo's colicky screams, which had blissfully abated, started up again with renewed vigor. Curse that howler demon of a baby, Lon's father growled, but a smug smile crept over his exasperation. The oft-quoted Kekonese old wives' tale was that the more unmanageable the infant, the better fighter he was destined to become. In the distance, a new sound pierced the night, air raid sirens over Janloon, shrieking atop Hilo's bawling. Lon's father ignored the noise and continued in a calm undertone. A man who wears the crown of a king can't wear the jade of a warrior. Gold and jade, never together. We greenbones live by Aisho. We defend the country from its enemies and the weak from the strong. Kaul held his son out at arm's length. His left eye narrowed and his expression grew thoughtful. After this war is over, after the Shotties are defeated, the clan will have to rebuild the country and protect the people from disorder. I don't think I'll be alive to see it, Lon, but you'll have to be a different kind of greenbone than me.
Have you read the entire book aloud before, or?
No. Well, actually, I'm not sure that's exactly true because I often do read aloud when I'm proofing it and doing the final round of copy edits to catch any last little mistakes, typos. So I've probably read every section out loud, but not in order. But if any of you are watching and you like audiobooks, the Jade City audiobook is fantastic. So it's narrated by Andrew Kashino, who is a very talented voice actor, and he does a fantastic job with the Jade City and Jade War audiobooks.
Is he going to be doing Legacy as well?
Fingers crossed. I just turned in the final pages, or the proof pages of Legacy, and I haven't heard from the audio department yet as to what the schedule is for creating the audiobook, but I'm hoping he'll be back.
So thank you for the reading. Let's go on to Q&A from the audience. We have a lot of questions. Let's see. First question was, I really love the Green Bone Saga, and one of my favorite characters in particular is Wen. What prompted you to write a love interest who was of comparatively lower status than Hilo, but in some ways greener than him?
So oftentimes I've, like I mentioned, watched a lot of gangster fiction, everything Goodfellas, Godfather, etc. And a lot of the female characters, and most of the female characters in crime dramas, are often either very passive, either they don't exist really, or they're like the mob wife, the ignorant mob wife, or they're like the character who's trying to like stop or hold back like the male character from getting involved in questionable activities, and so I wanted to subvert that expectation. So Jade City starts with an introduction of Wen, where the reader thinks, oh, this is Hilo's girlfriend. And over time, you learn that she has a lot going on and has a very, very strong opinions and motivations of her own that put her both in conflict with Hilo and yet he's also his greatest supporter. So having that character who can't wear Jade take a really pivotal role in the family and in the clan was both a character challenge and one that like created a different like dimension to the relationships within the Kaul family.
You just do a great job of making all the characters well-rounded. Even, was it Bero? B-E-E-R-O?
Barrow, yeah,
Barrow.
Barrow. Yeah, Barrow was, so Barrow is a minor character in the story who is a thief. And the story starts out with him wanting to steal Jade. And he came on the page, I envisioned him kind of as a framing device. So I was like, oh, well, but this is going to be a pretty big fantasy story. And I want to start the story with a relatively minor character it'll be easy to follow him into the world. And then he just sort of stayed on the page. I thought, oh, I'm going to start with him and I'll sort of have him as a framing device at the end. And then he just, for those of you who read the book, you know that he plays some very, very important, he shows up at very pivotal moments in this story.
He just decided to stay. You couldn't get rid of him.
Yeah, and he's an important character to have because he, again, has a very different view of the world than the Green Bones do. One of the things that I loved about writing the Green Bone Saga is the multiple points of view and being able to sort of explore both the family and the world by having these characters' perspectives overlap, and they're all seeing each other in slightly different ways as well. So it makes the whole thing feel more nuanced because you're looking at it from different angles.
Definitely. I don't think I'd be able to say who my favorite character was, but Is there anything you're looking forward to seeing readers' reactions to in regards to Jade Legacy?
Oh gosh. Well, you know, when you have very opinionated readers, you know you're not going to please all of them. And I already know that. There's, you know, people want vastly different things out of the third book. And so at the end of the day, I have to write the story that I want to write and the ending that I want to see. And I'm really happy with how it turned out and how it all came together. But I think, you know, I'm definitely going to, once it's out, it'll be off of my desk and out into the world. And there's definitely parts of this third book that I think will come as a surprise to readers, and there'll be things that will feel like they were, you know, they were a long time coming. So my hope is that there'll be things that are surprising, and the things that aren't surprising are very satisfying. So yeah, I'm also always happy to see fan art. So that's probably the other thing I'm really excited for.
Do you search for the fan art, or do they send it to you?
Oh, if they send it to me and I see it, I'm automatically going to reshare that, because it's probably one of the joys of being an author, as somebody who can't draw, right? I can put the words down on the page, but then it's always fun to see how people take your words and add their own layer of interpretation to it. And I think that's one reason why I was mentioning the audiobook and Andrew Kishino's great narration was it was such a fun experience to listen to someone else read my words. It's as close as I've gotten so far to seeing like a, you know, movie adaptation, because you hear the characters' voices and someone else is interpreting them. And so there's a little bit of like your brain having to adjust and be like, oh, okay.
Do you now hear his voice though when you write the characters? Is it that?
Sometimes, yeah. For some of them. And yeah, like there's some character, there was a few where I was like, oh yeah, that's exactly like how I envisioned that character sounding. And others where I was like, okay, right. Like having to read, yeah.
That would be an adjustment. I have that for other adaptations. You know, you read the book and then you see it on TV or in the movie. That's completely different.
Right.
Yeah. A bit different of a question. Where did you grow up? And did any childhood experiences influence your writing?
Well, I grew up in Calgary, Canada, which is, I don't like is there anything in particular? I mean, very long winters, very cold. Very beautiful but stark prairie, and you know, that might maybe have contributed to me being in the library an awful lot and doing a lot of reading. But it has seeped in a few places. My very first novel, Zero Boxer, has a character who is from Toronto and is a city I know very well because I lived there after I grew up in Calgary. I moved to Toronto. Oh, and there is something else actually. So Jade City has a map, but it's not your typical fantasy map. So there is a map of the island, but then there's a city map. And I know you can't see this, but I'm going to hold it up anyways. So the city map of John Loon has a subway system. I don't know if there are a lot of other fantasy novels with city maps and subways, but but the subway system that runs through John Loon is Toronto's subway system, the shape of it. So it's that's a little Easter egg for anyone who has ever ridden the Toronto subway system.
Now I want to, after you say that. I think Terry Pratchett's series, they have trains, but I don't think subways, right? But they're more satirical. This one is about writing and world building. I came across a piece of advice you gave for world building along the lines of writing new locations throughout your world/story. Since Jade Legacy and the upcoming supplemental stories will bring this narrative to a conclusion, what spaces were you most excited to return to and reimagine?
Gosh, so the heart of the story is John Loon. I think probably the thing that I most enjoyed about it in Jade Legacy was seeing it change over time, writing the changes to the city over time. And so by the end of Jade Legacy, John Loon has changed. You can feel that it's sort of a different place than it was at the beginning of Jade City. And there's also places in Jade Legacy that you haven't seen yet. So Jade War, a good chunk of Jade War takes place in this other country, Espenia, which is kind of analogous to a Western power, like the US or Britain. And so there are sections of Jade City where we return there. There's also places that are new. There's another location called Markukuo, which has not been visited yet, and is kind of like it's like you just have to wait until Jade Legacy and read it, then you'll see it. So when I world build, I know kind of the rough pieces, and when I start out, so I don't like build the entire map of the world right at the beginning. I built like John Loon and Kekon in great detail, and then as the narrative occurred, I thought about, okay, where else do these characters need to go? Like, what other elements of the story need to occur, and like what kind of makes sense in terms of like the world outside, and like how that's affecting like geopolitical politics and trade and military buildup and all that. So I always try to keep in mind that the story drives the world building as opposed to the other way around.
I did like how you kind of changed the focus, like you just said, in Jade War, how you went international, and I found that very interesting because, like you said, all the different influences came in a bit more than what we saw in Jade City when it was sort of in the flashbacks. So just applauding you.
Yeah, so with each book in a trilogy, so the thing about writing a trilogy, we talked about this before, was like the needing to build. And the first book, the way I thought about it was the first book is really about the story of like these clans and this island, and the second book takes that international, and the third book takes that intergenerational. So that was the scaffold that I used thematically to build up like the saga over the 3 books.
You have to wait till September, you said? Is it September?
It comes out November 30th.
Right.
Which will be here before you know it. I know it seems far away, but I finally got the for sure date for Jade Legacy's release. It will be November 30th.
We can wait. We can reread the other 2. Yeah.
That's right. Plenty of time to read the other 2.
Oh, another question is Godfather-esque and mashup and analog and globalization are provocative tags in your visual imaginative world. So you write with an eye to translation to the screen/film?
I don't specifically. So it's not that I'm writing with the intent for it to be translated to screen. But I'm naturally a very visual storyteller because I love movies. I'm often drawing creative inspiration from film. And so I think that naturally makes my work something that's screen friendly. So the Green Bone Saga is under development right now, and it's fascinating to kind of see the adaptation process. And if it does hit the screen, it'll be, my hope is that like a lot of the things that are in the book translate really well into the screen, like aesthetically and in terms of like the tone and the cultural inspirations and just the general premise feel of the book.
I think it would translate really well. This isn't an audience question, but have you thought about like a graphic novel adaptation? something like
graphic
that.
novel. I mean, that would be cool. I mean, but you know, it hasn't. I cannot draw, so it would have to require finding an artist and having a publisher and so on.
You could give more, not give more, and have more conversation with the artist to show your vision of the world and how their vision was. I think it'd be very interesting to see.
Yeah, that would be.
Maybe future. Oh, can you speak about how you drew on our world's history as you were working out the Jade City setting? Were you thinking especially of certain countries or drawing more generally on histories of colonialism and conflict?
Yeah, so I'll talk to the time period of the trilogy, because I've had people ask, like, when is this supposed to take place? Because it's a modern context with cars, airplanes, etc. But there's no cell phones yet. You know, people are still running around trying to reach each other on payphones and stuff. So part of the reason for that was narrative, because you know, what is kind of like a gangster fantasy without muscle cars and Tommy guns, things like that. So it obviously lent itself to a modern setting, but it also evoked kind of post World War II economic boom of Asia and the rise of Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and like those nations rebuilding after World War II and going through this period of just rapid social economic change and leading into the Cold War. So those of you who are reading the Green Bone Saga can pretty clearly tell that there is a Cold War-esque situation going on between two major powers in the world. And Kekon is kind of caught in the middle because they're this island with this really valuable resource, and they're most definitely going to be a potential target for you know, outside powers that want this resource. So the answer to, you know, is Kekon itself based on any one specific country? No, because I was trying to build a place that felt very much like its own thing and was not analogous to any particular place in our world. And so people have asked, is it based on Hong Kong or Singapore, Taiwan, or Japan? And my answer is always, it was an amalgam of a lot of those places. And it draws on, you know, on inspiration from the Japanese Yakuza and Chinese triads, and as well as Italian, you know, Sicilian mafia, and you'll recognize, like, I was always very careful to not be super specific in terms of language. So you don't see words like sushi or, you know, adobo or anything like that, because I wanted Kekon to feel like its own place that was very recognizably East Asian, but wasn't a place in our own world. But the cultural, the global context of colonialism and modernization, globalism, and like the outside powers, which vaguely resemble countries in our own world, should feel very recognizable. So it was the entire thing was just walking this fine line between being, you know, its own unique thing that was not tied to our world, and yet also representative of our world.
Definitely makes sense. Wait, different track again. Did you bring anything from your first career as a management consultant to your writing career in speculative fiction?
Yes, because I think I do. So I think about the economics of my fantasy and worlds probably more than the average fantasy author. I think there's oftentimes you read fantasy novels and you're like, who's paying these orcs? How is this running? How does the Dark Lord make money? I mean, I don't know. So I do think a lot about the economic forces in my fantasy world, and like Jade obviously being like this resource that has like economic implications for this island and for this people. And also, no, I think that like, you know, I think the other thing that really helped from my previous background in management consulting was I would do projects where I would go into client companies and have to learn about another business really quickly and get up to speed really quickly and then move on to another project. And writing is kind of, it's a little bit like that. So when I take on a new book, you know, I have to really immerse myself and do a ton of research and like devote myself to a project. And then I also have to kind of close it and set it aside and move on to another project. And so I think also just like the discipline of treating writing as, you know, as a project-based career and managing like those different aspects like of authoring and writing in a way that where you kind of realize, yeah, this is my art and like I love writing and I want to tell these stories, but at the end of the day, I also have to market it and to sell it as a product, and my publisher has to make money off of the books, etc. So, you know, in some ways it filters into the fiction, and in some ways it can impact on the way I think about myself as a writer.
There was almost like a level of like business intrigue in Jade City as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's things like trade embargoes and you know, a cartel politics. And I did have a reader come up to me at a book signing a few years ago, and I just remember it was so great because she said, "I just want to thank you because I'm an accountant and I have never seen accounting represented in a fantasy book ever." And that just really warmed my heart.
It seems like you could have a quiz, like, are you a luck bringer or are you a fist or a finger in?
Right.
We've still got time for a couple more questions. You have such intricately detailed politics and twisting plots in the Green Bone Saga, spread across so much time and so many different characters. What's your process for planning and keeping track of all these different story threads?
It's hard. I'm just going to say out loud. The process is that I work in a software program called Scrivener, and I have a whole bunch of files, and I just start dumping things in them. And I might have a file for individual characters, for, you know, holidays, for cars, for weapons, for, you know, like just and everything. I'll have these different folders on my computer, and also I have a notebook on me that I'm while I'm writing this, I'm often having to stop and move to my notebook so I can free write and figure things out. And I use a program called Aeon Timeline to keep all the events straight. So it is now this massive thing because it covers the entire Green Bone Saga from like before Jade City to like very end of Jade Legacy. And it's got a lot of events on it. And every character is an entity in there with their birth date, etc. And so I use that to keep track of continuity, because I've had times when I've had a scene and things move around. There's so many, this trilogy at times was threatened to break my brain because there were a lot of story threads and moving pieces, and making it all work felt like trying to solve a like crazy Rubik's Cube. And if there are any writers watching, you know what I mean, where it's like you tug one thread and the whole thing falls apart. So you're constantly, things move around and you change something and then that messes something up somewhere else. So I'd run into things like, once I came across a scene where I had these kids talking and I realized they can't be talking because they're 8 months old. And they weren't originally, but the scene got moved. It's like, you know, things like that. And fortunately for me, I also have my copy editor who helps keep track of all those things. But I think every writer has to figure out their own method. I have friends who keep wikis. who, any sort of have all sorts of organizational strategies. I have friends who swear by spreadsheets, and they have like just oodles of spreadsheets. So whatever works.
If you tried doing it in note cards, would that just fill your entire house?
I've done that before.
Oh.
I've tried, like, there's times that I've, needed to figure out the chronology of a sequence of scenes where, yep, I've used note cards and I've stuck them on the wall, and had just like colored Post-its spread out all over one wall. Yeah, anything.
Whatever
Sometimes
works.
you need to just look at it a different way.
Because if you're more visual, yeah, you could do that. Let's say, here's another question. When you're drafting, are you creating these different characters and the motivations at the start, or do you add them as you find the story needs them?
I try to have the basic story, their personality, their motivations, their role in the story figured out before I start writing, but they're still not fully developed when I start, because inevitably as you write, you learn more. And by the time you reach the end of the book, you know the character much better than you did at the beginning. So that's what revision is for. You write, and then when you go back and revise, you find a scene where you're like, wait, that is not what that character would say. I know the character now a lot better than I did before, and he would say something different. So it's an iterative process. It's most definitely one in which you need enough to get started. And the characters to a certain extent, and then you get to know them better. So you go through and you go through it again, and then you go through it again. And oftentimes it's stripping it out. So sometimes when you first write a scene, let's say it's a tense emotional confrontation, which are some of my favorite scenes to write. When you first write it, it sounds the dialogue sounds kind of superficial, right? Like, I don't know, like a sort of typical bad cable drama, right? Like, but nobody talks like that. No one really says, I can't believe you slept with my sister, no. So like you start off with that sort of very base level character interaction. And then, as you revise and you go through, that scene can turn into like just a frosty glare between two characters, or like something in which they're saying something, but really they're saying something else. And there's a subtext going on. And as the author, you're drawing that out. So the reader knows that there's tension here, but like, now it's this character knows that he slept with his sister, but he's not saying it. Like there's the nuance gets just polished, like with these characters as you go along. And that's super fun. Like I love that part of just finding, a point at which the characters feel super real, and how they would behave, what they would say, what they would think in a given situation.
Are all the characters still in your head right now? Like,
oh yeah. Yeah, because I just finished turning in the third book, and so they're very fresh in my. I mean, I've been living with them for a very long time, and so they're very easy for me to write. And so the challenge for me now, because I've got new projects, is I don't know those characters yet, and so it's weird. It's like I've left, I don't know, middle school, gone to a different school, and now I like new people. Like, who are these people? Like, I don't like you as much, and so I've got to get to know new characters.
Moving to a new place, or
right.
I think we have one last question, and it might be perfect timing. When you first wrote Jade City, did you know it was going to end up as a trilogy? And is that a choice writers typically get to decide?
So when I wrote Jade City, I didn't know whether it would be purchased by the publisher as a trilogy or not. So what most writers in that situation do is write the first book so that it is satisfying in its own right, but has the potential to be a trilogy, which is what I did. So I did not know that it would be a trilogy when I wrote the first book. I hoped that it would be a trilogy, but I didn't know. So I wrote the first book, and then when my publisher bought it, before I said anything, they were like, and we want 3 books. So at that point, I had to scramble to like send them a little synopsis of books 2 and 3.
You already had it in mind, at least. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly had it in mind that there was more story to tell, but you don't know. So you kind of have to be able to go either way, depending on whether you get a publisher who wants you to write more books or not.
What would you have done if they had said, well, we actually want 5 books, 10 books, you know, like the really long epic fantasy series?
I mean, few publishers will say that. Most of them will commit to 3. And you know, the series that go on for like 5, 10, usually that you have to go back as the author and be like, actually, I want to write more. So I was pretty content with 3.
You're done.
They're large books.
Yeah.
And I was, you know, I didn't want to get into the situation where they were getting like longer and bigger, because I've got other things that I want to write as well.
Other ideas, yeah. So I think there are no other questions. So I guess we are done. Thank you for all the questions, everyone, and thank you so much for coming, Fonda, and sharing so much about the story and the Easter egg. I have to go look at the map now. Can't wait for Jade Legacy to come out. And if you enjoyed this author event, please check out our future events on smcl.org/events. We also appreciate if you could tell us how SMCL did with this program, and we'll put the link in the chat. It's smcl.org/rate this event. And with that, I guess thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fonda.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Yes, it was great talking to you.
And also you can get book plates.
Yes, beautiful book plates. Yes, so I think we shared the link in the chat, and I'll send it in an email again after, so you can get signed Fonda Lee book plates for Jade City and Jade War. Yep. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fonda.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.